Hi, welcome to HTML Part 3, Forms and Attributes. Before we get started, I want to take a minute or two to actually start cleaning up our HTML page a little bit. So if you have your Notepad++ still open by chance, if you just continued from the previous video, you would still have your bare minimum HTML file open in Notepad++. You should also have your easy access to the file or folder that you're storing these files in. So one of the first things I want to do actually is I want to make a copy of this bare minimum HTML file. So what we're gonna go ahead and do is I'm gonna select this file, bare minimum.html. I'm gonna use Control and C to copy the file. And in the same folder, without doing anything else, I'm going to hit Control and V. And that's going to create a copy of bare minimum.html. Once I've done that, I want to rename this original bare minimum HTML file to, we're just going to call this HTML part 2. .html. So we'll rename that. Now once we do that, if you click back in Notepad++, Notepad++ is going to say, whoa, this file doesn't exist anymore. Do you want to keep it in the editor? You can just say no, and that's fine. It'll close it and it'll just open up this default new tab. Now in my case, I'm actually going to go ahead and close my instance of Notepad++. And you could do that too if you want. Actually, you could close Notepad++ down before you do that. But either way, once you open Notepad++ back up, if you do it in that order, it'll still have that file in the tab. And actually, yeah, but just approach it this way. So you'll rename the file. It'll ask you to remove it. You just say yes, and then you're fine. So actually, we're gonna change this bare minimum back to just bare minimum.html, and that was the copied version. So it's basically, we renamed it back to the one that it originally was. So we have an HTML part 2 and a bare minimum HTML file. So I'm going to go ahead and edit this bare minimum HTML file in Notepad++, and I'm going to go ahead and, there we go. So we added this in Notepad++. So the first thing we're going to do actually is we're going to remove, there's actually a simpler way to do this, but whatever. So we're going to go ahead and highlight everything within the body tag. We're going to go ahead and remove this. So basically, we want this bare minimum.html file to be essentially, again, a bare minimum HTML document. So before you go to start a new HTML file, you could literally just copy and paste this into another HTML file. So that way you don't necessarily need to type out all this content every single time. So this is basically, again, this is just a framework file for you. Now, yeah, so in HTML part 2, we're going to leave alone. So we can go ahead and close bare minimum. Well, actually, we'll keep bare minimum.html open. So we're going to go ahead and right click in your folder. We're going to create a new file. And we're going to go ahead and create another file. We're going to call this HTML part 3, yeah, that's fine. We'll call it HTML part 3. Remember, we have to rename the file extension to .html. Hit enter, confirm yes to rename it. We're going to edit this in Notepad++. And so now, as you can see, we've got two tabs. We have bare minimum.html and HTML part 3.html. So now I want to go ahead and take the bare minimum HTML content. I'm going to hit Control and A on my keyboard to select all, or you can just highlight it all manually, or just hit Control A for the shortcut. I'm going to use Control C to copy it. I'm going to click over to my next tab, the HTML part 3, and I'm going to hit Control and V to paste it in there, and I'm going to save this file. So now I've basically taken the content from bare minimum.html and put it in HTML part 3. I'm going to go back to bare minimum.html, and I'm going to use this little X here on the tab to close it. So that way we only have part 3 open. So now we've got everything organized in our folder. So now bare minimum contains truly just the bare minimum. HTML part 2 is everything from the part 2 exercise that we performed, and part 3 will be just what we do in this particular video to keep things straight and simple. So now let's go ahead and we're gonna open this in Chrome, HTML part 3. So if you had the other page open in Chrome, be sure to close the bare minimum page in Chrome on your tab, and then open this one up. So again, this will be a blank page as we've started with. We're basically starting over from scratch with just the bare minimum HTML content. So we're going to go ahead and kind of set this in the background there while we work on some of this new stuff. So one of the things that I wanted to get into first, while I did the title of the video says forms and attributes, we're actually going to approach it in a reverse manner. We're going to take a look at HTML attributes first. Now, as you may remember, we've already used some attributes in our HTML. If you recall back to the previous video, in hyperlink tags, we had, or anchor tags, we had href attributes, which an href attribute, which then we defined what URL the link tag would take someone to when they clicked on it. An image tag has a source property or SRC property and that or attribute, and then we basically set the value of that to a URL or some file that contains some type of image. So we already know what attributes are, but there are a handful of attributes that we did not review that are beneficial and should be known before we approach and learn anything about HTML forms. So the first thing we want to take a look at is we're going to look at a property known as ID. So there's an ID property. So for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and create a div, and I'm going to specify this property ID equals, and then I'm going to call it div1 for the sake of a better name. And then I'm going to go ahead and remember we got to close our div tag. So I'm going to close my div tag. So now I basically created a div where it has an ID of div1. Now an ID is a unique identifier in a document, in an HTML document. No other element. And let me clarify this, because this is something I think I failed to mention in previous videos. So we have div tags. You have an opening tag and a closing tag, but everything within this section of this div is really referred to as an element. This thing as a whole is an element. So if you heard me mention the word element in previous videos, that's what I was referring to. Is it's everything between the opening and closing tag. So this is a div is an element here. This makes up an element. So no other element on the web page can have the same name. Now, you could do something like this where you copy and paste it and you have two divs with the same ID, but that's going to cause you problems because, again, if you have, and only mainly from a JavaScript standpoint, if you have any language or processing in the back end like PHP or .NET, you could cause issues with your ability to process your web page if you have multiple elements with the same ID on your page. So you want to be very careful in that you don't name things. So you have to be methodical when it comes to how you name elements. Now, div1 obviously isn't the greatest name in the world, and you could certainly get confused if you have a lot of divs on your page. If you start just start incrementing the value div1, div2, div3, I mean, that might be kind of, ridiculous and careless. So just for simplicity's sake, we're calling this div1, but you want to give your elements meaningful names. So that way, programmatically, if you want to access those elements, you know that you're not accessing just div1, you're accessing, div header section or div middle section or div bottom section or div placeholder, whatever it is that's in that div. You want to ID your div and name it something practical and something that is relevant to the content it holds. Now there may be certain cases where generic IDs like div1 makes sense, and most likely that could be if you're programmatically adding elements to a page, and something along those lines, but we're not really there yet. So as of right now, just make sure that when you ID your elements, you use names that make sense. So next attribute we're gonna take a look at is the name attribute. Now, name is still somewhat relevant, but I can only think of really one reason why. Well, two reasons why. One, there is a specific input type where if you use the same name for that element, actually no, I had three reasons. So so there's a certain type of input that we're gonna cover where if it's a name, if you have multiple of them and they're named the same, it's a way for the browser to know that those elements are grouped together. The other reason why you would have elements of the same name, so let me step back. Elements can have the same names, whereas you shouldn't have the same, or can't, quote unquote, can't have the same IDs. They can have the same names. So names are a way to allow you to group items together. So if you have multiple items of the same name, in theory you're basically creating an array of items. So if you have 5 items on your page and they're all named some item, as that's a generic name, but some item, essentially you can pass that list of some item to some type of program. JavaScript can interpret it or read it. PHP can interpret it and read it like an array, and same with C# and .NET. So there's reasons why names can be the same for elements on your page, but for the most part, your name can reflect the same as your ID. Another way to look at this, and again, if you're used to doing any type of development at this point and you're just kind of looking at this for reference or thoroughness, whatever the case may be, so attributes can be looked at as key value pairs. So ID is the key and the value is div1. Name is the key, the value is div1. So that's just another way to think of attributes, or is just a list of key value pairs. So that covers names. The next tag we're going to look at is, and again, so just so you know what this does, I mean, we're going to go back to our page and we'll refresh our page. As you can tell, I mean, there's nothing in our div, and nothing's going to show up because we ID'd it a certain way or named it a certain way. We're going to go ahead and put some content in here, or some div content. We're going to save that, refresh it so we can see some content. I mean, it doesn't look any different because we have a certain ID or name. It doesn't matter what the ID or name is. Again, it's only for reference purposes, from mainly for development purposes, or programmatic access and whatnot. Actually, the other part where this will come into play is with cascading style sheet. So that's another reason why you should at least ID everything. And again, like, you can name everything and that's perfectly fine too, but not necessary. So the next attribute we're going to take a look at here is known as the style attribute. So a style is a cascading style sheet specific thing. So without getting into, we're going to get in a little bit of CSS here because the next attribute I cover, we're going to have to do something to show how that works. So a style attribute essentially is a way for you to put cascading style sheet information in line with your element. So one thing that I can do is, let's say I want to make the color of my div content blue. In this particular case, I can just say color blue with a semicolon at the end. You should always get used to putting semicolon at the end of any style sheet related stuff. It should be there, and it's just syntax you should follow. All right, so I put this style equals color. I want my color of the text to be blue. So this style sheet, or this attribute is saying the color of my text is going to be blue. Blue is the value of that attribute. So if I refresh this page, you'll notice my div content has changed to the color blue. So we're going to go ahead and copy this content just that to prove a point here for the next item we cover. So I'm going to remove the style tag here. We're going to call this div2 content. So we separate that. I'm going to refresh the page. So now we have two different divs with two different types of content in there. So the next attribute we're going to cover is the class attribute. Now a class attribute is a way to reference cascading style sheet defined class names, whether they're inline, whether it's inline CSS in your HTML document or CSS that you're referencing from another file on your web server or some other website. So a class would be something like, let's see, we'll just call it div2 content just for this purpose. So right now I created so I have this, I'm referencing this class named div2 content. Now I'll go ahead and save that and refresh this page. Now you notice there's nothing different about anything in here. My content is still the same, but if I do this, and remember, one of the things I mentioned about our header section in our document is that we can put inline CSS in our document. So this is what's known as inline CSS. So inline CSS basically means that I'm going to put and specify style sheets in my actual HTML document. I can't imagine there's that many people that do this anymore because it's far easier to keep your content separate. You keep your style content separate from your HTML, and some of the reasons why that is because sometimes some organizations and companies have people who just they specify or their exclusive purpose is for improving the visualization and appeal to your website for its users. UX experts is what they call them, UX. So those guys are responsible for like configuring your look and feel of your website. Well, one of the one easiest way to do that is the developers will put in your hook, so to speak, into your HTML that then your UX guys will go and start creating style sheets for, and that way your UX guys can work separate from what your developers are doing. Now, I don't know how reasonable and often that happens today, but some companies are so big that, you know, that kind of stuff does happen. So, but either way, so in this particular case, we have this class that we're referencing called div2 content. Now, in order to reference or create a class in CSS, I'm literally just going to type in .div2 content. I'm going to have some opening curly braces and a closing opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. So when you're working with CSS, and again, we're going to have a whole thing on CSS. I'm just doing this to show you how this is going to work. So I'm creating something just called div2 content. And now, again, I'll explain more about this when we get into CSS. For now, I'm just going to say font weight bold. So I'm going to say the font weight is bold, and usually you should have spaces in there just like that in there. So now I'm going to save that, and I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. So apparently I did something wrong there. Okay. So this is what happened. Looking at this, I didn't close my style tag. See, this is one of those things. You notice I didn't close my style tag. So before I even save the document, I'm going to open up developer tools, and I want to take a look at what Chrome is looking at. See, if you look at Chrome, because of the fact I didn't close my style tag, Chrome's like, whoa, like you notice how like the highlighting is kind of messed up compared to the rest of the document? It's because I didn't close my tag properly. So that again, that's one of those dangers with HTML. HTML with it not being a compiled language, you don't know until you actually pull stuff up. And this is again, this shows you exactly how developer tools can help you out and show you that, oh, it sees this tag, but then like none of this other stuff's highlighted, so it's kind of like what's going on here? So I closed that. So technically I'm gonna go ahead and undo my change here. So I have the style type, because technically you should have the style type specified in your style tag. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, refresh this, and now I have my div2 content. And if you notice, it's actually bold. If I wanted, I can come back here and say color red as well. Refresh that. Now I have bold red div2 content. So that is how you reference a style, a CSS class. And again, I'll explain more about defining classes and customizations and stuff like that when we get into CSS. But for now, just understand that that is how a class, CSS class, is used. Wow, that brain fart there, it took me a minute. It was something simple and I overlooked it, and that happens to the best of us, especially when you don't mess with this kind of stuff that much. And you don't do inline style, which normally I don't do. That's, you know, it's one of those things it's easy to forget. So now we've got our class. So that covers our class attribute. So now let's move on to our last and final attribute, which again, it will make no difference to the document whatsoever, but this is something that is useful to know for programmatic purposes later on down the line when we get into working with like JavaScript and stuff like that. So HTML, I believe this is HTML5 that added this. And I think technically you could probably use this with any version of HTML and it would probably work fine, or at least HTML4 and above. There is an attribute known as data attributes. Now, a data attribute is something where you prefix the attribute name with data and a hyphen, and you name this essentially anything after the hyphen should be whatever you want to call it. So I want to call this data dash div to info, and I'm gonna not specify, well, I'll put something in here. So we'll just call it extra info. So basically these data elements are essentially placeholders for data that you want to put in your HTML content that could be used programmatically to maybe make some functionality work a certain way or whatever the case may be. It's basically a way to inject additional information into your HTML elements. And it could be a way to help you avoid, like, you know, maybe some extra server calls or calls to your web server that you would normally make without having this information available. Now, you probably wouldn't want to put sensitive information in here. You definitely wouldn't want to put sensitive information in here, put it that way. But if it's something to help power your web page, then it's something that you may want to consider doing. It's something you can consider doing. Now, if you notice, Notepad++ doesn't highlight this in red. It doesn't know what this is, and that's really what it's just basically just some kind of, even though it is a valid attribute, it's not an HTML attribute, a built-in HTML attribute, so it's not going to highlight it in red for you. So that's where things get a little tricky, but it's not going to hurt anything to have it in there. So I specified that extra info. I come back, I save the page, I come back to Chrome, I refresh that. There's nothing different. But if you look at the elements, you'll see that Chrome shows data div to-info equals extra info. So the browser will retain that information, so that way when I'm using JavaScript and other stuff within the browser memory, it will be able to pull in. I would be able to reference this data from JavaScript. So it's a pretty neat little thing. The reason why that's relevant and important is because one of the ways that people used to do that in the past We'll actually get into that in a minute here. We'll cover that. Actually, I need to add that to my list. So I just thought about something new that I can add to my list. But so this covers what I wanted to cover for attributes. So we covered the ID attribute, the name attribute, the style attribute, the class attribute, and the data dash attributes. So again, data dash or data hyphen, whatever you want to call it. Again, you name them whatever the heck you want, and the browser just keeps it, and you're good. And then you also learned a little bit about how you do some inline CSS. All right, so moving on to HTML forms. So this is where things start to get good. So now, HTML forms. Why would you use an HTML form? So let's say, have you ever been to a website where you need to complete, depending on how old you are, you may not have done this before, but maybe like, let's say you sign up for social media account or something like that, and a website prompts you for a username and a password, and then once you've done that, then you've signed in, and it asks you for your profile information, and it wants to know your first name, your last name, your date of birth, whatever information a website would probably try to obtain from you. Those are HTML forms. So that is like the bread and butter, more or less, of web development. That's where web development is. That is web development. I'll put it that way. Like, HTML forms is web development. Now, obviously you can do web development that doesn't involve HTML forms, but when you get into pure web development where you're writing code behind the scene, you're writing code that is processing the information in that form and writing data to a database, and or maybe calling web services and stuff like that. That is the bread and butter of web development. That is, you're a true well-rounded web developer. You've gone through all those types of things. So anyways, we're going to go ahead and put together our first HTML form. We're going to go through a lot of different input types to show you examples of what those input types look like, and so that you understand like how to create these things yourself, and you can just mess around with them. So the first thing that you need to do in order to basically define an HTML form is there is a form tag in HTML that says anything within this form section is an HTML form. Now there's other properties. In order to save a form, there's other properties that you must put, or attributes that you must specify in the form tag at the opening form tag, but we're not going to specify any right now because really we haven't learned any of the back-end development side of things, so there's not really much we can do with this information. So for the time being, we're gonna just have an opening form tag and a closing form tag, and we're gonna mess around with a lot of different elements in between, form inputs in between that for you to get comfortable with. So we've got our form defined. Now, if we save this and we go ahead and refresh the page, you're gonna notice, Chrome shows that there's a form here, but there's no content in there, so there's nothing to display. So a form in itself does not do anything. So let's go ahead and start putting in some elements. So let's go ahead and one of the simplest elements that you've seen is a text box or some type of text input area, whatever you want to call it. Input boxes or the input tag is used to define a plethora of different types of form input. So input is a tag, but its type attribute defines what type of input it's going to be. So if you thought that like, oh, for a text box I would have like a text box element, and for like a checkbox I would have a checkbox element, and for all these other different types of types of input controls you may have seen on a web page, they don't all have their own types of elements. They're all kind of wrapped, most of them are wrapped up in the input tag, and the input type again specifies what type of input it's going to be. So we're going to start with one of the most primitive one, which is a text input. And let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and close this. Actually, we'll show, so input types, again, similar to images and BR tags, for example, there is no closing tag for an input, so you don't have the, closing, an actual closing input tag. But again, consistency says you should always close every HTML tag that you open. So you should close your input tags with that slash at the end to make sure you're closing it. So we've already now just defined an input on our HTML form. So I save the document and go here and refresh it, and look, now I have an input box. I can type in here, I can type spaces in here, I can type whatever I want. Now, if you notice, the more I keep typing, it'll just keep scrolling. Some things that you can do to customize the way an input box looks, or not, actually, I'm going to stay away from the way it looks. So the way it looks is going to be CSS and other frameworks that will help us with that kind of stuff. One thing that you might want to do is say, like, this input that I'm capturing, it shouldn't be more than like 10 characters, for example. So I'm going to say the max length. This is a max length attribute of an input type text. Is the value, the max length is 10 characters. So if I go ahead and go back, I'm going to save that, go back here and refresh this web page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And anything I try to type after that is locked down. So I am restricting, I am enforcing some validation on the front end just by specifying a maximum length of that input box in HTML. I would highly recommend that you understand and you get familiar with the ways to restrict input in HTML, because if you don't, one, that potentially leaves a website that you work on open to things such as SQL injection. You make it easier for hackers to try to find ways to try to hack your website. But then on top of that, you also have to spend a lot more time on the back end validating and cleaning the data that's being submitted to you. Now, in theory, you should be doing that anyways to an extent. So a lot of time is spent on the back end sanitizing data, but at least you can provide for your typical user, ensure that if the maximum length of something should be 10 characters, that you just don't let them type in more characters up front. So from a UX experience as well, you make it easier for your users to use your website. If I just left this, if I knew that the maximum length of this input box was more than 10 or less than 10 or 10 characters or less, and I didn't tell the user that, or I don't have any way to indirectly communicate that to them, they'll type in like 100 characters, and then when I go to save the form, then I'm gonna have to have some type of error message that says, oh, well, it needs to be 10 characters or less, and then of course you're gonna say, well, why did you just tell me that, right? So these are implicit ways that you can communicate to your user how big the input box is without, you don't have to put anything on the form that says it's max 10 characters. You can if you want, but you don't have to. But this is one way that you can fulfill that type of thing. Now, another interesting thing that you can do is, and again, this isn't a means to be used to communicate anything to the user. There's other ways to do that. We're not going to get into it now, but if you wanted to predefine a value to show up in this box, I want to put my first name in there. So value equals Stefan. I'm going to refresh the page, and if you notice, the value that defaults in there is my name. So you can actually default values as well in these boxes. And the reason why that is relevant is, let's say you have data from a database. The user wants to edit their profile, and you want to display back to them certain things about their profile that they completed when they signed up during the initial registration process. You go ahead and you would basically you would specify the values from your database when you're writing out your HTML and preload that information for them, so that way they're not having to retype information or anything like that. Another thing that you would want to possibly do, I wouldn't necessarily advise doing this too much. There is also known as a read-only attribute. Now, technically, I believe per the HTML specifications, you could just type in the word read-only and that should be fine. To be compliant with XHTML, the XHTML standard, that says that you should always have, every attribute should have some type of value that follows it. So every key should have a value. So read-only equals true is another way to just say it should be read-only. So now if I save that and refresh this page, I have a read-only input box. If you notice, when I click in here, you don't see the cursor blinking like you would if I could input in it. I can type in here, I can press spaces, press the space bar or backspace to try to remove it. It doesn't do anything. So now the input box is truly read-only and the user can't change anything in that input box. Let's see, what else we got? Okay, so that covers for the text box. We're going to move on to the next thing. So we're going to go ahead and copy this. Input type equals password. Ooh, kinky. No. So passwords. So we have a password input type. Now actually I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to put a BR tag here to separate these inputs. So before I refresh the page, if you notice, input types only take up, just like span tags, for example, or just plain text in the body tag, it only takes up the space required to display that particular item. So you need to either put your inputs inside of div tags or paragraph tags, or use BR tags to put spaces, new lines, put them on separate lines. So now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. So now you see my other input directly below my top one. Now this is a password input type. Now password input types, you can also specify max length as well, because it is just text. It is just plain text. And this is where things start to get a little different in HTML. So depending upon the type of input, some of these attributes that you specify may no longer be valid. So for a password input type, max length and value are completely relevant. Read only is also another relevant one, but there's other attributes that apply to other input types that don't apply to a text input type or a password input type. So we're going to go ahead and refresh this page again. So we have a password with a max length of 10. 1, 2, oh wait, that's pretty neat. So I can type in up to 10 characters, but if you know, since it's a password, it's not going to show me what the password actually is. And I believe no matter what you do, you cannot find out. I don't believe there's any way that you can find out what the value of this actually is. Now, the one thing I would say is when specifying password values, you usually don't want to preload existing passwords unless you have some type of encryption or decryption algorithm that will allow you to do that, where you're not sending someone's password over the wire in plain text. Even if you are using a secure website, it's not normally recommended that you preload someone's password back onto a web page. Unless you have some type of additionally secure means to do something like that. So just a hint there. So you normally don't want to have a value specified for a password ever. So in this case, again, like I can type whatever I want, up to 10 characters, and that's my password. So that's our input password. We're going to move on. There's not really that much special you can see there. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of lines in between each one of these so we can get some space so everything's not so congested. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and now we're gonna check out checkboxes, and I believe it's check. I thought it could be checkbox, but for some reason I always think it's check. So you have an input type equals checkbox. We're gonna go ahead and close that there and refresh this. Okay, so that did work. So an input type equals checkbox. So that basically just says this is an input checkbox. Now one thing that I forgot to do in all this is IDs. Now IDs, again, they should mean something. They should be something relevant, right? So my ID is first name. My ID is password. My ID is going to be check option. Let's just say mail. We'll just do that, right? I believe. Again, I haven't worked with checkboxes in like forever. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and put a value after this, specifying mail, for example, and then we're gonna right next to, well, we'll put this under it, but we know it's gonna wrap next to it, and we're gonna put female here, and the value is gonna be female. The check option is going to be female as well. So I could have just copied and pasted that. So go ahead and refresh that now, like when you check these boxes. And again, check boxes are not mutually exclusive, so that means that there's no way to group check boxes, so to speak. That's where radio buttons come into play, and we'll get to that just after this. But essentially you can check and uncheck these. And the reason why I use the value that you see there, if you notice when I specified, even though I specified the value of male or female, that didn't really do anything. It didn't show anything different on the actual HTML page. But again, when you submit a form, the value that's specified here is what gets sent to your web server. So if I don't check, for example, my male option, then I'm not going to get that value for male is not going to make it to my web server. The same thing would apply for female. Now you wouldn't necessarily use male female checkboxes because, I mean, I guess you could nowadays, but either way, I mean, typically most sites are not going to use a checkbox to ask whether or not you're male or female. It's going to use a radio button to say you basically are one or the other. You're not both. So that's how you would specify checkbox options. There's not really much more you can do with checkbox options. So you notice, like, you're not going to have a max length for a checkbox. You're not going to have, I don't think you can make checkboxes read only. You might be able to, but why you would, I have no idea. But you probably could. But yeah, either way, so that's how a checkbox would look. Next thing we're going to move on to is our radio buttons. So this is where things kind of get interesting. So we're going to go ahead and copy our male and female options here, because why not? And we're going to go ahead and change check to radio. Our input type equals radio. Not as in like the radio you listen to. And then so now we have value male or female, blah blah blah, and so now we have a male and female radio checkbox or radio button. So I'm gonna refresh that, and now you can see we have male and female, but wait, isn't it aren't these mutually exclusive? They should be, right? So this is where the actual name value comes into play for radio buttons. So I'm gonna name this name equals gender. And I'm going to put that name equals gender attribute on both the male and female options. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page, and I'm going to click on the male option. Now I'm going to click on the female option. And now, because of the fact that these two have the same exact name on the form, now the browser knows, oh, they're in the same group, so I can only choose one of these. That's pretty neat, huh? Oh, actually, one thing I wanted to show. So if you wanted a default, let's say checkboxes, checked, there is a checked option. Now, I believe checked actually applies for both radio buttons and for checkboxes, which is weird, but that's how it works. I'm pretty sure. So checked equals true. And again, HTML says you just need to have the word checked, and that should be enough. But if you wanted to check this box by default, let's say you already knew they were a male, and for some reason you wanted them to have the option to change it or uncheck it, you could pre-populate this value from a database, for example, and so now male is checked by default, and I could uncheck it or whatever. That just means that when the page loads, it should be checked. Checked. Oops. I want to copy this. Name equals true. And if you want to know to undo something, if you paste something or type something in and you want to undo it, the shortcut value to do that is Control and Z on your keyboard. That will actually undo something very quickly for you. So if you pasted something by accident, you can Control Z and that will undo what you pasted. All right, so checked equals true, and again, this is coming from memory. Yeah, so that's how it works. So checked equals true even works for radio buttons. So male. So if you wanted to default an option for one reason or another for your radio button, then you would do that. And checked equals true works for that. And you could even take that and put that in for your female option. If you wanted the female to be the default, then female is the default option. All right, next. We're moving on to let's do hidden. So there's also an input type, and I didn't want to give it away at the top when we were talking about these data attributes. So input type equals hidden is a way to put content on your web page that, again, anyone who has access, anyone who can open dev tools, essentially that's anyone who's smart enough to know how to do that can do that and view that data that would be in your hidden field. So we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna show you how this works. So I'm gonna put a hidden attribute, and really the only thing that is even valid to put here at this point is a value. My secret password. Show you how this works. So I'm gonna put in this hidden input. Now technically a BR is not relevant here because a hidden input doesn't actually display on your page, nor does it take any page space on your page. I'm almost certain of that. But either way, so I put my hidden input there. It's a secret password. I refreshed. Oh wait, that's weird. Oh, I put ID. So the type has to be hidden. That's why it showed up in a box. So input ID equals hidden, type equals hidden. I'm gonna refresh this page. So now you see I don't have a hidden input value there, but this goes to show you I can see this value, my secret password. So you definitely don't want to put anything important in here. Now, if it's something that will power your application, you probably want to, you could consider putting that in there. But just like with a lot of inputs, and again, we'll get into this when we go through like sanitizing input, you do want to make sure that you do sanitize this information when you process it on your web server. Or even potentially in your JavaScript. Now, JavaScript, you don't normally see a lot for sanitizing data. That's usually on the back end. You just want to be careful about what kind of content you put inside these HTML elements, because anyone and everyone can see that data one way or another. Just because it's hidden from the user when they go to this page, hey, look, there's nothing there, right? Even when you click on the hidden item here, you notice that Chrome doesn't highlight anything because there's nothing for it to render on the page for that. But just because it's not visible here doesn't mean that you can't see it here. So something to just keep in mind. So we're going to go ahead and leave those BRs where they're at. We're not going to put any more because the hidden input item is not going to render. Now we're going to move on to buttons. So input ID equals, we're just going to call it button for this case. The type is also going to be a button. I don't know why I put sub, but button. And value equals button. No, actually, input button. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So now we created a button refresh this, and now if you notice we have an input button. Now if I click this, it doesn't do anything. Now one thing to note is that input buttons by default do not cause forms to be submitted. So we're not there yet to get in too much detail there, but I will just say that input buttons do not, inputs with a type of button, type specified as button, does not force a form to be submitted automatically. But this is just to show you that you could have a button on a page for one reason or another that does something that doesn't trigger your form to be submitted. And this could come in handy for certain things. You know, let's say like if you wanted to have buttons to increase or decrease the value of something. And again, this is more like if if you were programming or writing some JavaScript code, for example, if you had a button that you wanted to use where you clicked on a minus sign to decrease a value and then a plus sign to increase a value, you could write code to do that, and you would portray that or render that on the page to the user in a form of a button, so that way when they hover over it, you know, it acts like just like an HTML input button. So that's one thing you can do there. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next thing. Again, like buttons, there's not much we're going to show there. I'm just showing you that you can put a button on a page that way. Now we're going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to go ahead and do an input ID of submit. The type is going to be a submit, and we're going to call this input submit button. Now again, the value can be whatever you want it to be. It's what displays on the actual button itself. Typically you don't want these things to be really long, but for the purpose of the exercise, I'm using longer names than you normally would. Now this says input submit button. Now if you notice when I click this, my URL changed. If you notice this, it says, it actually submitted this, and it actually slapped on this gender equals female. This is actually triggering the browser to try to submit this form somewhere. And because of the fact that we haven't specified what this form needs to do when someone clicks a submit button or submits the form, Chrome basically just submits it back to itself, and then provides the key value pairs, the list of key value pairs of everything that would be submitted along with that form. Now we're going to go ahead and put in names for each one of these. For form inputs, you're going to want to make sure that you specify a name for your form inputs in addition to IDs. Maybe I would just say as standard practice, do that. Let's see, name equals hidden, and I'm going to show you why in a second. I think I just saved all of that too, though, unfortunately. So it might kind of screw it up a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and do this anyway. So name equals submit. So now we went and put in, basically the name that I used was the same as the ID for each one of these things. So I saved the document. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. Now, if you notice the first time through, and you can go back in the video and look at it again to show what happened there, but if you notice the first time through, I showed you that it submitted the form to the page to itself, and then it slapped on this, it put like a question mark, gender equals female right here. It shows it in my browser history. It basically submitted, it's trying to push that data to the web server essentially. So that was the only form value that was submitted. And if you notice, the only reason why that was is because our radio buttons were the only ones that have the name attribute specified. None of these other items on our page have the name attribute specified, and none of them were attempted to be passed in the URL as part of our form post. So now that we've got our names on these things, I'm going to go ahead and click the input submit button again, and now you can see that it submitted first name equals Stefan and password equals empty value because we didn't put anything in there. But remember, we had a default value for our first name, so that's why it put that in there. Our check option equals male, or check option male, you see it has an empty value. And the reason why that's empty is because, oh, sorry, I take that back. check option male equals male. So that was submitted. Now, if you notice, we actually have check option female, but that's not in this list. Well, the reason why it's not in the list of parameters that were submitted in the form is because we didn't check the female option. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing back-end development. And again, we'll get into that later on, but some HTML will not submit by default will not submit items that in the checkboxes that aren't checked, essentially. So you have to have a way to deal with that on the back end. Gender equals female because that value is chosen, and then we have, oh look, in plain text, hidden equals my secret password, and submit equals input submit button. So now if you noticed, Chrome actually added in these plus signs. Now in the back-end web server, you would get the value with spaces, and that would be completely fine. But in HTML, in a URL, spaces are not valid in the URL. So that's just the way Chrome handled filling in those values or filling in those spaces with values. But that's not what you would get on your backend web server for processing. So that's how a form works. So we've submitted a form essentially, but again, this button does nothing. This one is the only one that will submit the form for us. So now that we have that, now typically your buttons, as you've probably seen if you filled out a form before, the button is usually the last thing you have on the page. So all your form elements should come before your actual input buttons to make it, usable for your end user. But for the intent of this exercise, I'm going to go ahead and just keep appending to this. I just wanted to show you buttons. We're going to move on to some things that, we're going to move on to another type of button actually. Now this type of button technically does not need a name, I believe. We're going to call this, the name of the value is the ID is going to be reset. The name is going to be reset. We'll just put one on there anyways. The type is going to be reset. And we're just going to name this one reset. Reset button. How about that? So we have a reset button. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. Now we have a reset button on here. Now what happens is, let's say I change these options. So by default, male is checked, female is unchecked, female is selected here for the radio button, but male is not. If I hit this reset button, it basically resets the form back to the state that it was when the page loaded. So a reset button could come handy, but I don't normally see places anymore that have reset buttons because it just doesn't seem too relevant at this point, I guess. I'm not sure, but either way, so you can reset the contents of a form back to its original values if you choose to give your user the option to do that. That's kind of up to you. But most times now you don't really see reset buttons anywhere. All right, so that was a lot of the default tags I wanted to show for inputs. Now we're going to move on to input types that were introduced with HTML5. So these are actually going to be HTML5 specific things. Everything that we've done up until this point is not HTML5 specific. It's HTML specific, and a lot of those things were valid in HTML4 as well. But these input types that we're going to deal with now are only valid in HTML5. So we're going to go ahead and copy one of this input, and we're going to call this color. The name is just going to be color. The type is going to be color. So that's the important part, is the type. The value, I don't believe we want to specify a value for this. We're going to choose a color next to this, and we'll address some of this craziness that we've got going on here in a minute. So we added a color input type. So now I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page, and now I have this little box up here that says choose a color. If I click this, it actually brings up a color dialog in the browser. Now not all browsers will necessarily do this, but this will allow the user to basically like pick a color. If you want to have them like customize like a color of something, I'm not sure what it would be, gift wrap, or I don't know, a shirt or something like that, you could have them choose like a very specific color and get down to the details of like what they wanted to pick, the hue and everything. Click OK, and then the browser will save that, and essentially you would send it onto your web server. So a neat little thing. You know, the ways you do that in the past would probably be like a Java applet that you'd have to create and, you know, write special code to do all that. And now HTML basically just gives you the ability to do something that is very simplistic, and it probably should have all along, but you know, if everything was great the first time it was originally done, there would never be expectations for things to get better. Things would just always be great. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Probably a bad thing. But anyway, so we have the color input type. The next one we're gonna look at is let's go ahead and say we're gonna call this birth date. So one thing you may notice is that I actually use what is known as camel case for, this is called camel case. This is referred to as camel case. Camel case means that the first letter that you type in this value is a lowercase value, and then when you, the other subsequent letters are going to be capitalized. So check, the C in check, the O in option, and the M in male. See, these two are capitalized. Check, option, male. Those are three distinct words, and the two words that follow the word check are going to start with a capital letter. So that's known as camel case, and that's pretty that's a pretty good standard when it comes to working with HTML. So something to probably get used to. Not everything's just going to be a one word ID, and most of the times it's not. But for simplicity's sake, a lot of these are. But either way, so that's referred to as camel case if you didn't know. Birth date, let's see, so the name is going to be the same thing. We're going to call this birth date as well. The type is going to just be called date. Now, what is your birth date? Right? What is your birth date? So we're going to go ahead and refresh this page, and now there's, oh, look at this. There's a input box with a date value, and it's got a drop down, and I got up arrows and all sorts of stuff I can do with this. And if I click down on there, look at that. The Google Chrome is providing me this interface. This is nothing to do. I wrote nothing other than to say get a date, and Google Chrome is letting me do this. And I can pick a date, and it shows that date in there, right? Pretty cool. Now the one thing is like, well, how could I have been born today, right? Or I guess how could I have been born tomorrow, right? Well, how do I limit that? Well, I could say the max birthday is 2018 07/21, and I'm gonna go ahead and refresh this page again. And now, in theory, look at this. So when if I try to choose a birth date beyond today, I can't actually choose that. So again, a feature I wrote like nothing to make that happen. Back in my day, I'm gonna be one of those old guys, right? Back in my day, no, in traditional web development, normally the way this would work is you're creating a text box. They're typing in a value in here, and then through JavaScript or backend server side validation, you're okay, is it a date? Is it in the right format? What format is it in? You have to convey to the user what format it needs to be in. Whereas Google Chrome basically just gives them an interface, and it tells you what format it's going to be in. So I mean, that's pretty darn cool. And there's going to be a conventional way that it's going to submit it to the server for you as well. So that's a pretty neat little thing, and you can, again, you can change the date, you can select the month and decrease it or increase it, and obviously, either way, it can't be beyond 2018 in this case because our max value is in the year of 2018, so it can't go beyond that. So it goes to year 1 basically. Now, oh God, wait, how could someone be born from the year 0001, right? So I want to say the min value is 2000 and... Oh, actually, no, not 2000. We're going to say 1900-01-01. So January 1st of 1900. There should be no one that's that old at this point, but they could possibly be. Anyway, so Now that we've done that, now if I wanted to, I can set the date. I still have my max date of today. Now, if I click down on here or up here, look at that. Now my minimum year is 1900. So they can't go back to year 0001 and provide me or falsify a date. Now they can still falsify a birth date, of course, but again, you can only do so much to validate data sometimes, but this is the way you do it. So you can specify a minimum date, a maximum date in the date input. So a neat little thing, a new thing in HTML5. Again, that's why sometimes you have to think, wow, how did you poor saps deal with this stuff prior to HTML5, right? It was a pain in the butt. So neat little things they're adding and very beneficial things that they're adding. Thank you, W3C. And thank you, browser developers, for implementing it. Because again, the W3C can recommend all they want and suggest all they want to the HTML specifications, but it's up to the browser developers still to decide what is included and what is excluded in their version of their browser. All right, so another neat little thing that we can do here is input type equals, or input ID equals range. We'll just call it a range. Name equals range. Now, typically I would refer to this as a range slider. The type is going to be a range as well. So, so with the range, let's go ahead and see how this looks. Choose a number. I don't know why you would do it this way, but we're just going to do this for the sake of having something. So we're going to say choose a number. Now I can slide this thing back and forth. So it basically gave me this default slider, and you know, unfortunately a slider is very primitive. I don't think anyone, I don't know. I mean, it's meant to be customized, I should say. So in its basic form, it's extremely primitive, but it gives you a way to basically indicate to a user, hey, I want to decrease something or I want to increase something, right? So a slider with this means like absolutely nothing. Now we can look at dev tools, and this is where dev tools can help you significantly at times. Is now notice that I'm sliding this thing around, but dev tools isn't telling me anything, which is kind of sucky. Now if I choose this date in Chrome, let's see. See, I thought for some reason that would actually change. So I guess it doesn't show me the actual value. So I guess there is some JavaScript needed in order to change the DOM to do that. But either way, so Chrome's not telling me what the value is here, so that's kind of sucky. But right now I don't have defined like, well, what is the minimum value and what is the maximum value, right? I mean, what numbers am I even dealing with here, right? You know, I mean, this alone doesn't mean anything. It's just some random slider thing that people can play with, and it has zero value whatsoever. So a range control or input type, you can tell the control or the input what the min value is. Say min equals, let's say 1. The maximum equals 100, and we'll leave it at that. And we're going to refresh the value. Now again, this doesn't really tell us anything. So again, without JavaScript, some things, some controls, some inputs are pretty useless. This really doesn't tell me anything at all. Technically, we know this is 100 now, and we know this is 1, and then we know if we refresh the page, right now it's setting it to the default value, which is directly in the middle, so we know that value is 50. Now, if you wanted to set the value specifically, you could say the value is 25, for example, and save that and refresh. Now it's going to set it to where value 25 is at. But again, like without JavaScript, JavaScript would be a way to help us show like this input value to change, but Chrome isn't going to tell us anything at all. Now if I click on this, I wonder, now yeah, see, it still doesn't tell you what the value is, which is kind of pathetic. But anyway, so that's that. But this tells you what the number is, or this is a slider. We'll put it that way. So, but if again, like obviously if you wanted to use a slider for some reason to indicate something to a user, you're gonna want to actually have a different a mechanism to show them maybe what value is actually currently selected when they move that slider around. All right, so that's a range input type. Next, we're going to move on to an email input type. So we're going to say, we're just going to take this part, email address. Now, typically in forms, you're not going to put your labels, so to speak, after your inputs. That's kind of bad practice unless you have like a real legitimate reason to do that. But in this case, is just for simplicity, and then we'll deal with that soon. So input type is email. Simple. It's an email address. But an email address, I don't actually want to click in there. But because of the fact I specified email, basically what that means is if there's other websites that you've been to where you've typed in an email address and it's used this email type, that list will actually pre-fill in this email box. So like if values you've typed in with the name of email, I think it's actually the combination of name and type, I believe. I can't remember. But Chrome does have a built-in feature where will autofill certain options, especially if the names or the values are customary or consistent with other forms that you filled in before. But either way, if I click in here, it actually showed like other email addresses that I filled in other forms. I don't want to expose that sensitive information, so that is not going to be displayed in this video. But that is one thing that you can do. So you can put in an actual email address. Now email address, I'm sure you can also put in a value because it is just a text input. Me at youtube.com. I mean, not that would ever actually exist, but there you go. There's me at youtube.com, and so now there's an actual value in there. But either way, now it says certain browsers may actually validate the email address for you. Chrome may actually be forgiving enough to do something like that. But essentially, the browser should try to enforce that the value in there is an actual email address if it's done correctly. Before, again, like all you would have is, a standard input box, and you would have to validate it via JavaScript using like regular expression to validate an email address, is validate as best as possible that it's a valid email address format, or you would do something server side. So moving on, so we had email address there. So next thing we're gonna do is month. So there is a new type. Again, this is all HTML5 stuff. There is a new type called month. Now this is where you actually tell Chrome what the month is of that particular year. Now it shouldn't put in the date, but it should just be based on the date you select or the month you select. So it selects, if you see in Chrome, it's highlighting everything, not just the date. It's the date overall. So I choose today, it says the month is July 18th, or July 2018, sorry. So it actually puts in the year as part of the month as well. So apparently W3C felt that if you're gonna have a month value in there, that apparently the year is something that should be included as well. So that's how it works. So that is the month of year, or month control, or month input type. Moving on, we have the number input type. Let's go ahead. Number. I'm gonna call this number. So we're gonna save that, refresh the form. Now we've got a number input type, and if you notice, there's a little up and down arrow. So now I can say, I can go negative, I can go positive, and I'm assuming you're thinking of this, but hey, you know what? If I want to limit to what numbers they can choose, I can say the min is 1 and the max is 100, right? And refresh. And now when I do this, if I click down, they can't go lower than 1. And if I went all the way up, they can't go higher than 100. Now, if I go, now let me type 1,000 in there. So that's maybe an unfortunate side effect there. Chrome's not validating that that's actual valid input. But if I click again on one of these up or down arrows, then it's resetting it to the max value. So it looks like I can type in whatever the hell I want in there. So number controls, obviously they could be good, but then the fact that a user could input in them could be bad for you. You can also specify a default value as well. So if maybe you wanted to say the value was 50, it starts at 50, and then they can work their way down or up. Let me try something. I don't think this would work, but what happens if a number is read-only? Yeah, see, so it's now, then it's just a regular text box and you can't even change anything. So pretty pointless. And that's why sometimes you just gotta mess around on your own time and see what you can do, what HTML is capable of alone without any JavaScript or server-side development. All right, so moving on, we are almost done here with the inputs. Again, I wanted to show off a lot of these because I feel like a lot of these are relevant for web development, and probably even more so nowadays than it was a while ago, especially because some of this stuff is new, and you should take advantage of new features when they're provided to you so that you don't make your life more complex than it needs to be. All right, so the next one we had the number, the min and max. Okay, so the next one we have is, what do you think it is? Home phone number. Let's say it's a telephone number. I'm not going to click in there because it will pre-fill. If you've ever had another form where you fill out a phone number and the type is telephone, I'm pretty sure it's based on just the type. I could be wrong, and possibly the name, but either way, if you type in a phone number, it's gonna display in a certain format. Let me go ahead and set a value here. Value equals 00000000000. Let's see how it displays in Chrome. All right, so it doesn't really display it any differently. It still lets me type in a boatload of characters in here though, which is kind of weird. So I'm not sure, like, exactly, other than for it being designated as a telephone number and allowing for like autofill from a form and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like it does anything special. And maybe I'm specifying the value wrong. I'm not really sure, but either way, that's just another way to specify a telephone input type. And last but not least, this will be the last input tag or input type here, is time. So again, if for some reason you wanted someone to be able to specify the time of something, time of birth, right? They can put in a time. So now it doesn't bring up a dialogue, but it allows them, basically it puts it in the format of a time. So 1:59 a.m., right? So that's how you do it. So that's what a time thing can do for you. And again, there's no time zone specified here, so you have to account for that when you're taking in input from people, or tell them it's time of birth EST, for example, right? So that way you have some consistency and you tell your users like what type of input you're expecting. So your labels that you put in front of, usually in front of your input, should have, should be descriptive enough so that people know what to put in those input boxes. All right, so moving on. Now the other thing I wanted to show as well is we're going to take a look at the select element. So oops, we're gonna call this names. Name equals names, and we're not going to specify anything else. Now a select element actually has, unlike an input, element, it has an open and close tag, and similar to, like, remember the unordered list and ordered list where it required that you put some content in there in order to be relevant. If we just took the select list the way it is right now, you actually see this is a drop down list, but there's nothing in it. So Chrome shows you it renders our drop down list, and that's essentially what we're trying to do here, is put together a drop down list, but there's nothing in it because we need to specify, we need to put the other elements in the list to so we need to specify some options to put in our list so that they can be selected. So option elements should include a value. Now option elements are actually one of the few, if not the only, tags in HTML that you don't need to specify, and you should not normally specify an ID with these. I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually specify an ID or a name for an option value, because it's just a value in a drop down list, and it's the context of it is within the context of the select element. So option value equals my name Stefan, and then we're going to put in the name Stefan here / option. So that's how you put in an option. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page so we can see, hey, there's an option in there, but there's only one. It's just my name. You can put in as many options as you want in a drop down list. Now, I would be careful about putting in too many options, because you don't want to have, you don't want the page time it takes to load take forever. I'm going to go ahead and just throw in like a list of names here. Some of you, if you're watching this, you may know who these people are, what names these people are referring to, but if not, that's fine. So either way, so we've got Stefan, Luke, Preston, Cam, and Gamer. We're going to go ahead and refresh the page, and now you see we have a bunch of different names in this list that we can choose from, and if I select it, it changes the value in the drop down list. And if we see our names, we can see that select look, it only takes up that particular area of the form or of the page. So if we put other content next to it without putting line breaks or div tags around this, it's going to wrap. But those are all our option values. And the reason why you specify a value for your option is so that when you submit this form and it sends it to the server, the selected value is going to be what gets submitted to the server. So that's something that you got to keep in mind. That's why you need to specify this option value. Now, typically, one thing that you would see in a drop-down list would be something like this. You don't normally see labels next to a drop-down list or all the time. You may have some. But one thing you might see in a drop-down list is something like this, select. And for value, we just say it's 0. Or you could leave it empty. You know, it doesn't really matter necessarily. You could say 0 or empty, and that's what it is. So that way, when a user comes to your page, oh, I need to select something. And that way you don't default a value, because the one worst thing that you can do by defaulting values is the user may not even look at it, and they could submit the form and never know they actually selected that value. So that's the reason why typically in web pages that you visit or with forms, they're going to have a default value selected so that you don't incidentally select something that you didn't know you selected. So choose a name. Right, so we'll choose a name next to that. So now we have a label that says choose a name, and now, like, you know, okay, this is what I'm choosing. Let me go ahead and choose a name, right? So that is a select list. Now there's another way to do. So let's say, what if I wanted the user to be able to choose multiple values in this list? Now, typically, I think you would normally handle this through style sheets, CSS, basically. Oh, actually, you know what? I take that back. I shouldn't have done that. Oh, yeah, no, that's fine, yeah. So, I'm going to specify the size of 5. Now, typically, you're going to do that in CSS. And let's go ahead and do this first before we save this. Choose a name. Choose multiple names. Okay. So now we're going to say choose multiple names. We'll refresh this, and now wow, I've got multiple names in this list. But normally the way that you choose multiple names in a list like this is you would have you would use the control key. You would push down on the control key, and you'd be able to click on a different name, and it would select them all, and it should highlight them all. But right now, I can't actually do that because I need to add another attribute to my select list that tells it that that's possible. And the way you do that is multiple. Now again, HTML expects just the word multiple, but for completeness and for clarity and for consistency with XHTML, you want to say multiple equals true. And now if I refresh this and I click on a name, I'm going to hold down the select or the control key and I click another name, and it's selecting multiple values. Now, the one thing that HTML can't do for you is you can't tell it how many values you're limited to selecting. HTML is dumb in that way. So in this case, the user could select all they want, and so if you only wanted them to be able to select 2 values, then you would have to use JavaScript or server-side validation to ensure that they only selected 2 values. Now, actually, another thing to bring up as well, we'll go back to this real quick. So we have all these different options. Now, let's say you had a drop-down list, but you wanted to preload a name from a database, for example. One way you can do that is you can say there's a selected attribute, and again, consistency, and for XHTML compliance, I can say selected equals true here. By default, it's only selecting these first options in my list because it's the first option in the list. But I can say when I refresh the page, now Stefan is the default option in the list because I said that that is the default selected option in the list. Now, if you notice in a multiple names situation, there is no default option selected. So if you actually wanted it to select this value that says select, oops, sorry. Oh wait, that was right. Selected equals true by default, then you would set that to selected, and now that value is selected by default. Now, normally if you have multi-select lists though, you're normally not going to default a selected option, and you're also not going to have, you wouldn't do this. You would get rid of the select option, refresh the page, and that way you just have this list here. Because otherwise you would confuse the user. Because what if they kept that selected? Then you may have to put something in your code to say, well, you can't select the option that says to select something, right? So why even put it in there? So again, that's a UX thing that you have to keep in mind when you're working on web pages and doing web development. And let's see. So one of the last things I actually wanted to show before we wrap things up here is a label. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to remove these BR tags at the bottom. We're going to go all the way back to the top of our form. We're going to look up here. So we have like our name. I'm going to go ahead and remove this read-only attribute from that. Not that it matters, but it will help emphasize what I'm doing here. So we have this name. Now I can type in it, and it shows my name and stuff in there. That's not really what I was hoping that it would show, but so now we have this name value here, and it shows my name in there. Now, one of the things that the things I wanted to do is I wanted to put a label on this next to this. So one of the ways that you do that is, instead of all these other cases, we're putting this just kind of floating text. And again, remember our kind of rule of thumb from our last lesson is that our rule of thumb is that everything should be inside some type of HTML tag, not in this case, I might say, before I said just not the form or not the body, but in this case, not just the form. You shouldn't have straggling text that's just kind of out there on an island that's only within the form element and doesn't have some type of, is not encased in some other element like a div or a span, or in this case a label. So a label has a specific purpose in HTML, and I'll show you what that is. So a label is similar to a span tag actually. So, and I'll go ahead and show you, we'll look at the difference we'll look at the differences. So I'm going to create this label tag. I'm not going to give it an ID or name because honestly I don't need to do anything special with the label, but I'm going to go ahead and put first name in here, and I'm going to close the label tag. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh this, and now I have a first name label. Now one of the things that you'll notice is that when I hover over this first name label, you'll notice that it's not giving me this, it's not giving me the input, like I want to say crosshair, but you know what I'm referring to. It's not showing me like I can actually like select it, and I can if I wanted to, but it's giving me a mouse cursor or pointer instead of the other cursor. So actually it is just the cursor, right? The blinking cursor ish that you would normally see if you click in a box, for example. So that's one difference. And if this is a span tag, it would work exactly the same. I'm going to go ahead and show you. We're going to do a span tag right here just so that we can illustrate the purpose. Span tag, refresh that. So we have first name, but if you notice, see if I hover over the first name label again, see that? So that's pretty neat. I'm going to go ahead and remove the span tag because we don't need that there. But I just wanted to show that to illustrate the difference between the two. So that's the first difference. Now then you're saying, well, okay, wow, that's great. Well, what does it do then? Well, the other purpose for a label tag is, and actually I want to change what I'm going to do this for, because when I clicked on my name, it actually Google Chrome gave me a drop down list, which I absolutely don't like, because then it's showing you personal information potentially that I don't want you to see. So I'm going to put this in the password field. We're going to change this to password. So it'll be a password label instead. So now I have it on the password here, and again it still shows the little cursor there, the pointer instead of the cursor here or whatever. So now we got our password label. Now I want to say this is the label for a control named, and I believe this works based on the this works based on the ID, I believe. We'll call it password. Label for password. Now what do you think that's gonna do? I'll refresh this form, and now if I click on this password label, pretty neat, it put me inside my password input box. So I mean, it's not necessary because wow, what user can't just click inside the input box, but it's a neat way for someone where they can just click on the actual text and it puts them inside the box, and then they can just start typing. You don't have to actually, what if you know, if they have a hard time clicking inside the box or whatever, for whatever reason, then you know it's just it's a convenience thing really. So it's nice to do things like that for your users from a UX perspective, just to make things that much more convenient. So that's what a label will do for you, which is why it works different than all these other things, and it just looks better if a label normally is in front of or on top of your input instead of to the right of it or below it. Sometimes that looks kind of weird. So that was, in fact, the last thing I wanted to show related to HTML forms. This has been a very long session, and I apologize that these things are so long, but I am trying to provide you as much information as possible and be as thorough as possible and kind of give you just my knowledge dump of all my experience that I've had working with this kind of stuff with HTML in the past. It's not something that's always easy to learn up front. And so some of the stuff I'm teaching you is stuff that you don't necessarily learn right away. It might take you might be like 5-10 years in your career before you learn some of that stuff sometimes, because you just don't have the need to use it. But I'm showing it to you now because I just happen to know it now. But anyways, so the one thing I leave you with, actually I'm going to leave you with this, is a neat little website for you to go to. And I'm going to drag this over here for you to look at. There's this website known as, it's www.w3schools.com. And if you notice that this is like the place to go. If you want to learn anything about HTML you know, maybe me talking to you for an hour wasn't your cup of tea or whatever, and you want to kind of learn at your own pace. Or if you, what I prefer you do is you listen to the videos, or you watch the videos at least, and then you come here to say, you know, I want to learn more about HTML. And so a lot of the content that we've went through already, W3 Schools covers as well. But W3 Schools will, if you just need a quick reference point for something, if you want to remember like, oh, well, we did HTML forms, what did we do there? I'm going to go to HTML forms, and W3 Schools is going to show you all you need to know about HTML forms, all the input types, the examples. They give you things you can do to try it yourself, and you can work within their browser, within a browser window, and they can give you examples of how to actually submit forms. And again, we'll get into that part later. But not for now. It teaches you some more different things that we may not have went into, and it also shows you XHTML, which again we did talk about this extensible hypertext markup language. This explains you why do you want to use HTML, blah blah blah. We didn't really get into all this stuff. Now again, we didn't use this data type definition. I did mention this in a previous segment of HTML. Now, XHTML uses a different XML. It uses an actual XML namespace and a data type definition. We're not doing all this, but I do, and even though you're not doing this, I still recommend that you follow suit with HTML, XHTML, right? Your elements have to be nested. Your elements must always be closed. Again, everything I've been beating in your head comes primarily from this website and stuff that I've learned over the years. There's even things that that talks about with like, well, divs, and it gets into classes and file paths and frames and layouts in general. And some of this stuff we're going to actually cover in subsequent parts of the series. So you can dive into this stuff all you want and try and get ahead, and that's perfectly fine. You're not gonna, if anything, you're just gonna be ahead of the class, and or ahead of, I guess, the class, ahead of the content I'm producing, and not behind, and that's perfectly fine as well. But I did want to show you this website because again, you can come here to learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript. This will teach you SQL, PHP, jQuery, Angular. You're probably saying, what in the hell? PH what? J what? You know, Angular what? You know, again, you know what CSS is because we talked about it. You know what JavaScript is, generally speaking, because we've talked about it. But all this other stuff, we're going to learn some of this other stuff. Not necessarily everything on here, but we're definitely going to learn some of it, and it'll be very beneficial to you as you're on your way to trying to become a web developer. So with that, I conclude our HTML part 3 on forms and attributes. You know, I hope you learned something watching this video, and we covered attributes and form elements to the nth degree. There's plenty of more that you can learn from W3 Schools if you want, but we covered a lot of what I felt would be the most useful elements. But again, I highly encourage you to visit w3schools.com to learn more. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, and if you want to see more of these in the future as I publish them, be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications. If you have questions regarding the video, be sure to leave a comment, and I will do my best to reply to as many comments as possible. If you know others who would enjoy this series of videos, be sure to share my channel with them. And stay tuned to the future for our next part in our series.